Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Small Business Insider Live, a live stream program hosted by the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council. My name is Christy Arslan, and I am SBE Council's Entrepreneur in Residence. And we do this program every week. Typically, we do it on Thursdays at 1:30, but today is a special day. We're having a special broadcast because President Trump had his first joint address of Congress last night. And so joining me today is Karen Kerrigan, president of SBE Council, and we're going to talk a little bit about the joint address. Hi, Karen, how are you?
Hey, Christy, how are you doing? A lot of late nights with all these events going on, right? So I'm doing great. I'm doing really great. How are you?
Good. Well, thank you very much for joining us. We, again, for everyone who's here, Small Business Insider Live is a live stream program specifically geared towards small business owners, entrepreneurs, policymakers, those who support small business. And our goal is to give you both feedback, advice, guidance, information, tools and tips about small business policy, tips to grow your business, and help to make sure that you have all the information you need to be a success. So Karen, we had a really big night last night, obviously, with President Trump's first address to Congress. And we love to get the small business perspective or the SB Council perspective on what you thought of the address. So what are your first initial comments about how you thought it went?
Well, it was really, I thought it was a good address. I mean, obviously, from a policy perspective, the president reaffirmed some of the issues that we're working on for small business, tax and regulatory policy and relief, reforming, both those systems, healthcare, affordable healthcare, and essentially reigniting the economy. So there's opportunity for all, there's better small business growth, and there's more entrepreneurship happening. I mean, that's desperately needed for our economy. And I could sort of, be picky and say, oh, we didn't mention entrepreneurship for small business, but it's, I think, more important broadly, that he did address the issues, and we're very passionate, about people identifying the problem, which we think is, we need more entrepreneurship in this country to have opportunity to create the jobs, more innovation, etc. But that being said, I think, look, he reaffirmed the issues that we're working on, the issues that small business owners care about. But I think more importantly than that, I mean, this speech, I was really relieved and impressed, I think, by the tone of the speech, very presidential. I mean, even if you were someone that didn't agree with the president on the substance with respect to policy, I look at, in order for the president to really move some of these very challenging big issues, regulatory reform, tax reform, healthcare reform, I mean, there really has to be a focus on the issues, hopefully to bring, more people on board, Democrats on board, their ideas on board, for, reforming what is really critical to the health of small business and entrepreneurship in America. So with a lot of the other pundits out there, I thought the tone was really good. I thought it was very positive, and hopefully that will continue, because again, this policy lift is pretty big that the Congress has to undertake, and then get stuff to the president's desk for his signature.
Yeah, I mean, I thought, as a small business owner myself and watching the speech last night, I definitely saw a different tone or approach than, we saw in the inaugural address or some of his other speeches that he's had. So I was really pleased to see more of a vision for the future of what he wanted to see accomplished and how he thought it could help, our nation and our nation's economy. He certainly touched on all the important things for small business: taxes, healthcare, regulatory reform. He also talked about trade, which for some businesses, we're in a global economy. People are looking, small businesses can look at trade as an opportunity, or they're concerned about trade, about how it impacts, their business or intellectual property. So I think he certainly touched on all of the important components. It seems like a very ambitious agenda. There's a lot of big items that, for, as we know, for years, Washington has been trying to address things like healthcare, things like tax reform, regulatory reform. So, you've been working here in our nation's capital on behalf of small business for over 20 years. What do you want to see happen first? And what do you think is the best course of action moving forward?
Well, I think, what Congress is doing right now, I mean, they've pretty much, established and what they are going to be, what the priorities are. Obviously, we see some legislation that's moving through right now on broad regulatory reform that passed the House. We see, a series of Congressional Review Act bills have passed both the House and the Senate, and the president has signed them. But on these broad issues, things are moving. The House and the Senate, they pretty much have, established the framework and the timeline for when these things are going to happen. Obamacare and healthcare reform being the first thing, and I, think that makes sense. Given sort of what the next package to come along is, which is tax reform and some of the issues that have to be worked out there. I mean, these are both complicated issues, so there's going to have to be a thoughtful approach, which I think is happening, but also some thought given to the transition of both of these, both Obamacare reform and tax reform. So, our hope is that you do get the healthcare reform and the tax reform pieces done this year. I don't think that, given that you do have a unified Republican Party on these, generally they control, both the houses and the White House, and a White House that is, very passionate, very motivated. Obviously, President Trump, is bringing his business mindset to all of this, and he wants this stuff on his desk, and he's setting up timelines. So I think it would be great if we could get those two pieces done this year, and then, work on these targeted regulatory relief bills that are happening right now. And even perhaps, tax reform can be done sometime late summer, early fall, and then, address sort of broader regulatory reform in the fall, early winter. I think all this would be terrific. Obviously, well, I think they need to strike now before complacency in politics, takes over. So I think a lot can be done, but it's got to be focused again, and that's why I like the president's focus on policy and substance, because that type of messaging, any successful entrepreneur knows that is critically important, to your audiences, and in order to sort of maintain momentum or traction in the marketplace, and in this case, the political marketplace, for getting things done and to your desk.
I think you brought up a good point, because, I think so many of us as small business owners, we're used to being a business owner, and very much like President Trump, where you want to change something, you make a decision and you change something. But government is very different. And so we all have to kind of harken back to our days of civics or social studies class to remember that while the president can put together, a framework and guideline and budget, it's Congress that has to actually draft the legislation and pass the legislation for many of these provisions, which is why I think last night's speech was so important, to really get everyone, particularly the Republicans, his party, on the same page with, the priorities that he wants to set forward and move forward on. I think you bring up another point, which is trying to get things done before we move into a political or election environment. We'll be having midterm elections next year, and so I think, it's important to get as much done as possible. But what are your thoughts about like the Senate side? Obviously, the House, you can pass legislation on a strict majority, where on the Senate side, the rules are a little bit trickier. And, it seems like everything always gets stuck in the Senate. We had, under the last administration too, they pushed through health reform, and then it seemed like everything else couldn't go through. And so what do you think is a good strategy on trying to get things done on the Senate side?
Well, I think this whole budget reconciliation strategy is a good one, right? Where you need a majority vote. I mean, you're right. The Senate has so many rules.
Yeah.
And it really, you know, is much more difficult, and it was made that way, right? The founders, in terms of getting things to the president's desk, you know, but I think will be less, what the concerns or what the considerations will be over in the Senate side are less about rules and more about politics, because there are, you know, Democrats, more Democrats than Republicans, who will be up for re-election in the next election cycle. You know, 10 of those states where there are, you know, Democrats who are up for re-election, Trump won those states handedly. You know, so from a political perspective, there are Democrats that where the incentive is, you know, to somehow work with this administration and to get things done on the key issues that matter to, I would say, not only small business, but the broader the voters as well at large, you know, and the economy being the number one issue. Obamacare plays into that, tax reform plays into that. So, you know, it's going to be interesting, you know, to watch sort of how the politics play out. You know, the president, in terms of his popularity numbers, not at the national level, but in those states, right? And how vulnerable some of these Democrats see themselves as being going into the next election. There are the moderates, they want to work with the president, but I think there's, you know, there's other Democrats too, and people will be surprised in seeing some of them maybe sign on to the Obamacare reforms, particularly as, you know, sort of the Senate and the House come together. It will be a different type of reform package, but also tax reform. I think you are going to see some surprises in terms of Democrats signing on to these if the political situation stays the same, and there isn't this massive drop in popularity for the president in those states. But, you know, you see a lot of confidence out there with the American public. You got great, you know, scores coming out of the address last night. I mean, obviously, you know, the stock market is booming. This all points to, you know, the momentum that we didn't see maybe with the last administration in terms of how all this will affect the economy, and then the political situation in the next cycle, which will be coming up shortly, as you mentioned.
Sure. So let's just dive a little bit deeper on some of the key topics. We'll talk healthcare first, since that was one of the big things that came up. The president seemed to talk about a framework or provided principles in his speech to members of Congress about what he's looking for. They seem to fall in line pretty well with what, you know, Representative Paul Ryan, who's, you know, the Speaker of the House and head of GOP leadership in the House, has been working on and put together. So what are your thoughts about some of the healthcare principles that President Trump had mentioned, and anything of significance that small business owners should be mindful of in case they miss the speech?
Well, I think, you know, you're right. I mean, a lot of the broader rhetoric in terms of having more affordability, a competitive marketplace, you know, people having access to coverage, the White House and the GOP leadership in terms of their blueprint are aligned. What I found interesting is two of the things that he mentioned in his speech were not included in that blueprint, but didn't necessarily mean they wouldn't be part of the final House package. And that was the pre-existing condition, you know, element of what Obamacare currently has, and the blueprint did not mention that, and also the national marketplace, having you know, allowing people to purchase health insurance across state lines. That was another piece that wasn't really specifically brought up. And I could be wrong, but I'm almost sure I'm not. I look at a lot of this stuff, you know, in the blueprint, but the president really hit on. So yeah, the two things that weren't mentioned, he really did hit on. Obviously, he hit on health savings accounts, improving them, and just having a system that was more accountable and responsive to consumers. So I think this is going to be very interesting. If people didn't watch our last broadcast, I did mention that both the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Ways and Means Committee are the two committees of jurisdiction who will be, you know, really working on the various specific reform proposals that sort of take apart Obamacare and replace it with something else. And the current Energy and Commerce Chair, Greg Walden, you know, one of his first bills is pre-existing condition piece. So, you know, that will be a part, almost guaranteed, of this House package that goes over on the Senate side. And the national marketplace piece, interestingly enough, there was a judiciary, a bill that was passed through the judiciary on a voice vote, bipartisan vote. And I'm going to go to my notes here because we supported the bill. It's HR 372, the Competitive Health Insurance Reform Act. That just passed the Judiciary Committee this week, which is a small part to make it a more competitive health insurance marketplace. What this bill does essentially is that it applies antitrust laws, competition laws to health insurance companies, something that they've been exempt from since 1945, and it was on a data sharing thing. That's why they were exempt. It had nothing to do with competitive marketplace, data sharing. So that's just one piece of a lot of things that need to be done to have this national marketplace, but that actually moves to the Judiciary Committee today. So, and
that's actually a big issue, because one of the problems we've seen with a lot of the Obamacare is just the consolidation of health insurers, and in some markets there only being one option because of that consolidation, and also because of the cost. So I think that could be
exactly the opposite to occur.
Yeah.
I mean, well, what we need is more people, more entrepreneurs, more companies that are offering health insurance. But I think the regulatory environment in general definitely is an impediment to that. We need innovators and entrepreneurs to be thinking about what the next generation of health insurance looks like. But unfortunately, the red tape and the regulatory environment is such that you don't have innovation occurring. And the current health insurance, they need competition from upstarts and startups but so all these little pieces are very important to getting to this competitive marketplace.
And one thing that President Trump did mention, which I know has been a concern for business owners, is, he really drew a hard line in his speech around mandates, basically saying that we should not, our nation should not be mandating that people buy coverage. So I think we can see that both the employer mandate and the individual mandate will, under a new proposal, they've already made strides to kind of lift that burden by giving some more flexibility to HHS to not, not enforce that. But I we can see that not being part of a future solution.
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely right on that. The employer and the individual mandates are two things that will go, for sure in this whole Obamacare repeal or new health insurance reform package. So that, and it is interesting because, gosh, I think they said, I'll have to look at the numbers and post them on the website, but it's a fair amount of people who decided, they did a poll or a survey, that decided to forgo buying insurance because they couldn't afford it and decided to take the penalty instead. I think close to 20 million people. Did you see that? Did you see that number?
Yeah, it was a large number because the penalties were less than the cost of coverage. So,
that's right.
They did a cost.
And I didn't see the breakdown in terms of who those are, but I would almost guarantee that a fair amount of them are probably self-employed small business people, Christy, because we really haven't addressed the cost issue, to get them into the market and buying health insurance. And, that's what, we were promised with Obamacare. And I tell you, that's one thing that if they do a reform package, it better bring down costs and create a more competitive environment, because we've been waiting for something like this for more than 20 years now. So hopefully it will do that, and these reforms will lead to that.
And on the tax side, obviously, particularly for small business owners, taxes are just a huge issue. And so any movement in regards to, again, like, this was a great speech in terms of setting out the policy priorities, and a lot of the priorities will align with small business interests. Of course, the devil's always in the details. So now, now we have to monitor Congress to see what kind of proposals are being put out to address some of these issues and the impact on small business. But any movement or thoughts on some of the tax reform proposals? Obviously, as you know, there are many small business owners who are pass-through entities, you know, S corps, LLCs, partnerships, sole proprietorship, so they end up paying taxes via their individual income tax rate. Any thought on both addressing corporate tax reform, which is important for the business ecosystem, and, you know, will encourage big business to do more business with small business, but also individual tax reform?
Yeah, well, that and just one before we leave the healthcare reform issue entirely, when you talk about taxes, but the other big piece, you know, of the health reform plan that small businesses should keep an eye on is, you know, rather than having subsidies, you know, to buy insurance, there'll be a tax credit. And so we're gonna, you know, it'll be interesting to see exactly what that looks like. I think in our last broadcast, I mentioned that, you know, we could have seen action in the Ways and Means and Energy and Commerce as early as this week, but what's holding them back is the scoring of all these proposals. So we're still getting specifics on, you know, how these will benefit small businesses and, you know, sort of the size of that tax credit. But that's what we'll be watching as well, you know, as these specific proposals, you know, begin to emerge from the Congressional Budget Office. You know, we heard that the whole proposal was leaked last week, and now it's dead. But I don't think it's dead. I think, you know, they just continue to work with what they have and work, you know, within their caucuses, work with in the committee, look at the amendment process, and, you know, and see where we go with it. But anyway, leaving that aside, because that is really important, and we continue to push healthcare reform. You know, is this whole tax reform issue? And you're right, the president brought it up again. You know, clearly he and his advisors are very, his leaders now, the new Secretary of Treasury, as well as Commerce, the SBA Administrator Linda McMahon, she talks about this a lot, is, you know, tax reform, making the system more competitive for all our businesses. But rather than talking about individual or corporate income taxes, they talk about the business tax rate, you know, bringing down, you know, whether, no matter how, you know, you're structured, that, you know, that all businesses are going to be paying this rate, whether it's 15% that he campaigned on, 20% or 25%. You know, there's various proposals out there. So, so I think, you know, in terms of broad tax reform, you know, all businesses are going to be included in that, whether you're, you know, an LLC or an S corp or a C corp. But that's a good thing, and that's a good thing. Full expensing. I don't think anyone is sort of going off, you know, on that or has a different version of where we should be on expensing, lowering the rates and making the whole process more simple for everybody. You know, the big issue is how are you going to pay for all this? I mean, that's, you know, what the point of contention is. And this whole issue of, you know, border adjustability and the border adjustability tax. And, you know, the business community, as reported by the papers, are at war over that, because you are going to have winners and losers in terms of border adjustability. And we see the president, you know, sort of going back and forth on that issue in terms of whether he supports it, he doesn't like it, it's too complex.
And Karen, just so people understand, that's the proposal that would require a tax on goods coming into the U.S., correct?
Yes, yeah. And, you know, and we've heard from our small business members who will be really impacted by that. You know, the importers of wine in their wine shops, or, you know, small retail niche shops that may import a lot of, you know, fashion, you know, dresses and jewelry and, you know, fashion, that this really puts them at a competitive disadvantage. And they don't see how, even if you lower the rates and do everything you do the tax code, they see their business, you know, suffering more because of this, not their situation getting better. So that's the whole issue right now, is this border adjustability tax. It does pay for the thing.
Yeah.
Tax reform proposal, even though they say, oh no, it doesn't, just encourage it. You know, we're not doing it to pay for it. We're doing it to encourage, you know, more business to be done in America and more exporting to be done. But it's a huge point of contention. And again, we're following it because we want to see the broader package. And if you're a business great enough, and you're doing something maybe on this border adjustability thing where it's not as much of a hit. Anyway, all these things we're watching to see on balance.
Sure.
If the big package is going to be great for growth, great for small businesses, entrepreneurship, and investment, and again, makes the system much more simple for them, because that's a huge cost as well, as you know.
Sure. Yeah, simplification, I think, is important, which I think is the important piece of, not the regulatory reform effort is not just rolling back regs, but looking at ways that we simplify our system, whether they be regulations through agencies or the tax code, so that it's easier for business owners to understand what's expected of them and also to be able to comply, and that it creates a favorable environment for business success and business growth moving forward.
Right.
But you brought an interesting point up, which I think was discussed a lot post the conversation, that, in addition to all the small business friendly pieces, there was, the president mentioned infrastructure and defense. And so, as a business owner, I'm always balancing my budget, here, at our business. And so how will they be able to pay for everything? Obviously, I know Republicans are very highly focused on the debt and concerned about the debt. But any thoughts on, what might happen to be able to afford or to offset some of these proposals?
Well, I think that's sort of the big question here in Washington as we watch this. I think on the scoring side, the Republicans are, we're scoring we love to score these things a little bit differently, right? In terms of being, if it costs this much, it's gonna, cause this much of a hole in deficit. In other words, that if you have progressive tax reforms, it's gonna add, to the revenues, and that we score it from a dynamic perspective as opposed to a static perspective. Those are Washington, terms. So I think tax reform is a little different, although costs will matter, and that people who oppose it or think that the tax cuts go too deep will be bringing this whole issue up, in terms of what's it going to do to the deficit, the debt, and are we just loading something else on, to the next, generation of young people. So that all these will play out, I think, very differently. On the infrastructure piece. This investment bank, we'll have to, again, see the details, this public partnership, how it's going to work, using both public, maybe incentives and private sector money to, build out and, modernize our nation's infrastructure. We'll have to see the details on that, but it should be an issue in terms of not, putting more money, not loading up, again, debt, and kicking the can down the road, if you will, to the next generation.
Yeah.
But I think there's a way that these can be done where you do leverage, again, private sector investment, and again, this is on the private on the infrastructure piece, where you can leverage private sector investment, into rebuilding and modernizing our infrastructure without without the public debt taking too much of a hit. But again, those packages we're really going to have to look at and see what the potential downside might be for taxpayers, particularly future taxpayers.
So as we're wrapping up, anything else that you wanted to highlight about the president's remarks, or anything else you think that business owners should keep an eye on as we move forward to, implement some of these proposals?
Yeah, well, I think, the president, again, he's sort of laying out his agenda and what he wants done. A lot of this is on moving through the Congress as we speak, and on, autopilot in terms of, not autopilot, but there is a plan, Obamacare, tax reform, some of these other things. But, as the president is issuing more executive orders, for example, he did one on Friday on what's called enforcing the regulatory reform agenda, so there's things that are happening on a parallel track. I think that won't necessarily have to be something that he signs, or goes through the Congress. For example, that executive order enforcing his regulatory reform agenda for the first time establishes regulatory reform officers and task force within the regulatory agencies who are actually going to be accountable for these executive orders. Not only President Trump's new executive orders, for example, on the one in, two out executive order, but also previous executive orders that were done under Presidents Obama and Clinton. They had fantastic executive orders on regulatory relief and reform, cutting red tape, but then no one was accountable within the agencies, or for that matter, in the White House, tracking what the agencies were doing to cut red tape, to review existing regulations, to look at what might be old. So I think that's a new thing that we're watching, and then we'll definitely have input with those regulatory reform officers and those task force. We think that's really good. That's a good thing to have accountability and someone actually in charge of doing these things within the agency. So that's a great thing. Again, at the congressional level, there's also reform packages moving through the Congress. For example, the House this week is voting on 2 other bills that we support. One is called the Scrub Act, and it's an acronym for basically, getting rid of unnecessary and burdensome regulations. Establishes a commission within Congress whose job is solely, again, to look at all these bad regulations, old regulations, both up or down. Sort of like a BRAC style military commission, if you remember that. They go up or down on getting rid of these regulations. And you may actually need that if you have these task reg reform officers who say, well, we could do things administratively, but this other thing is going to have to be done by Congress. So maybe they can punt or pass those ideas over to this commission, which puts them in a big package up or down. The other is the regulatory integrity. So that is, the Scrub Act is HR 998. More information on our website under Letters to Congress. And the other is the Regulatory Integrity Act, which also will be voted on tomorrow, I believe, which essentially makes the whole process of filing comments more transparent. Also, the regulators, their communication with outside groups makes that more transparent. This was a huge issue during the waters of the U.S. regulation. The EPA was actually going beyond being neutral, and I think it was the CBO actually did a report and said that they were actually doing propaganda coming out of the agencies, encouraging people to say exactly what they wanted them to say on the waters of the U.S. rule. They were encouraging comments to come in, but not doing it in a neutral way, telling them to take a position on issues. Well, this bill basically would get rid of that. If you have a regulation and you're proposing it, you get it out there, you let the outside groups do what they do, like SBE Council, asking our membership to weigh in. But the regulators themselves should not be putting in place sort of a propaganda machine encouraging these type of regulations. So all that will be more transparent and more neutral. And that bill will be voted on this week. So there's all these bills that are, again, things are moving on various tracks, and we're working all these tracks and trying to find what we think are the best pieces of legislation that can make their way to the president's desk. Again, having input with the White House and also input with the regulatory agencies as well, to provide other means for relieving small businesses of red tape and burden, which is in their administrative authority to do so. So we're keeping busy, Christy, and we'd love people to weigh in. Follow us, SBEcouncil.org. Sign up for our e-news. We're going to need your help on all these fronts, and also any innovative ideas that you might have too, as things are moving in these reform bills. There's always a chance to get an innovative idea on as an amendment if you have one. So please feel free to share those with us.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Karen, for your time, and thank you everybody for participating in this Small Business Insider live stream program. Again, as Karen mentioned, please visit SBEcouncil.org. Consider signing up for our e-news so that you could get our stay up to date with what's going on Capitol Hill and get some great tools and tips for business owners. Also, you could follow us on social media. Follow us on Twitter at SBE Council or like our Facebook page. Again, we do Small Business Insider Live every week. Typically, it's done Thursdays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Today was a special occasion. But please consider visiting us next week for our next Small Business Insider Live. Thank you again, Karen.
Oh, great. Thank you, Chrissy. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.